All right, good morning. Thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Ian Pager-Rogers. I'm a Senior Communications Strategist at the ACLU of Pennsylvania. I'm joined today by Mary Catherine Roper, who's a civil rights attorney at Langer, Grogan, and Diver PC, and she's the former Deputy Legal Director at the ACLU of Pennsylvania as well. Also joining us is Solomon Furious Worlds. They are staff attorney at the ACLU of Pennsylvania. So welcome everybody. We're here today because the ACLU of Pennsylvania has released Wasted Resources, the Failures of Stop and Frisk in Pennsylvania, or in Philadelphia, excuse me. It's a policy paper examining the illegal use of stop and frisk in Philadelphia over the past 15 years. Now, nearly 15 years after the ACLU of PA, a professor from Penn Law School and the law firm Carey's, Rudofsky, Messig, Feinberg, and Lynn, LLP, filed a federal lawsuit against the city of Philadelphia over its police department's illegal and racist use of stop and frisk. The police tactic remains an area of great concern for civil libertarians. In 2011, the city and the plaintiffs reached an agreement in Bailey versus City of Philadelphia that resulted in a consent decree that included an independent monitor of the city's stop and frisk data. Now, last year, the Bailey consent decree led to a citywide program that deprioritized the use of stop and frisk for minor offenses. The ACLU of Pennsylvania and other criminal legal reform advocates consider this program a success. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And to kick us off, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Catherine.
Thanks very much, Ian. Just for context, folks, I have been counsel on the Bailey litigation over stop and frisk since the very beginning. And this began, of course, before the lawsuit. Stop and frisk became a political football in Philadelphia during the 2007 mayoral campaign, when then candidate Michael Nutter responded to a spike in gun violence by saying, we need to stop everyone. We need to, make sure people are not carrying guns by using stop and frisk. After criticism from civil rights advocates, he shifted to calling for constitutional stop and frisk. That might sound familiar to you. And that is why we are releasing the policy papers, so that people can read for themselves and understand the history of stop and frisk in Philadelphia. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone or news to anyone that what happened after Nutter became mayor was anything but a constitutional stop and frisk. The Philadelphia Police Department hugely ramped up the use of stop and frisk, and not in a way that was effective. We civil rights advocates, the firm Carey's, Rudofsky, Messig, Feinberg, and Lynn, the ACLU, we watched as the number of stops skyrocketed and saw that less than 1% of stops were yielding any kind of weapon, much less a gun. And we saw the extreme racial disparities in who was being stopped. And that's why we filed suit in 2010. The city did not fight the suit, but instead said that they wanted to enter into a consent decree, which is essentially a settlement that's overseen by a judge. So in June 2011, we got the Bailey consent decree that you have undoubtedly heard about. And in that consent decree, the city promised that Philadelphia police would not stop people unless they had reasonable suspicion, which is the Fourth Amendment legal standard for a stop, and would not target people for stops on the basis of race. We are still operating under that consent decree. And just to sort of get to the punchline, that means the city has never fulfilled those two promises. In fact, what is always true is that filing the lawsuit, even getting that consent decree, could not do the job alone. Change happens when an issue becomes political and people mobilize. The city made almost no progress toward fulfilling its promises under the consent decree under the Nutter administration. By the time the 2015 mayoral campaign started, stop and frisk was again a political issue, but this time the community was rallying against it and putting a lot of pressure on candidates to say that they would change the police policy. Jim Kenney was elected mayor after promising to end stop and frisk. He didn't do that, but he did put Richard Ross in charge. And Commissioner Ross pushed accountability from the bottom to the top, from patrol up to inspector and captain. He ensured that there was accountability for legality in stops within the Philadelphia Police Department. And today, instead of the 50% of illegal stops that we were seeing when the lawsuit began, 85% of stops are supported by a legal reason provided by the police officer, and sometimes a little better than 85. It's been getting a little bit better in the last couple of years. That still means that hundreds or thousands of people are being stopped illegally. More people are being frisked illegally. That's all detailed in this policy paper. The number of stops is down. The number of stops, this is one of the things we'll talk about, aimed at very low level sort of nuisance behavior, like carrying an open can of beer. That has changed dramatically thanks to this lawsuit. And Philly police are now recovering more guns. Guns are recovered in a little over 5% of stops today. That is probably partly because the stops are more targeted at truly criminal behavior, and partly because we know that just more people are carrying guns since the pandemic. So that's a lot of progress on meeting the Fourth Amendment standard. We have not seen the same progress on reducing racial disparities. As you can read in our report, racial disparities in stops are still extreme and are basically unmoved since the beginning of the litigation. Since 2020, the court has ordered a whole series of new accountability measures intended to reduce racial disparities. We are still in the very beginning days of seeing how the police department is going to use those. In other words, the job is not done. And we know that the litigation alone is not going to get it done, because litigation alone never gets it done. Stop and frisk is again a political issue, with politicians again calling for an increase in stop and frisk because of a recent spike in gun violence. But one of the big points of this paper is there is no connection between more stops and reducing gun violence. Yes, Sunday's Philly Inquirer had a big article about the fact that shootings are way down from last year. That's not because there was more stop and frisk. It's not because there was less stop and frisk. Crime rates, and particularly gun violence, are affected by tons of things. As that article said, we don't know why the rate of gun violence is dropping right now. What we do know, just read the policy paper, is that there is no connection between whether the Philadelphia police stop tons of people or fewer people in a more targeted way and bringing down gun violence. There isn't that one-to-one relationship that politicians want to pretend that there is. So what we hope to focus on is the fact that stop and frisk has always been associated with racial disparities and racial targeting. There should be no discussion about increasing the use of this tactic until the Philadelphia police show that they can use it both legally and equitably. We urge the city leadership to stop invoking this failed tactic as a political football and instead focus on the work that it's going to take to change the pattern in racial targeting that has always accompanied its use in Philadelphia. Saul, do you want to pick up?
Yes, absolutely. And speaking of absolutes, Mary Catherine is absolutely correct. The job's not done, and progress happens when it becomes a political issue and when people mobilize. MC, as you said, has been counsel on this case since it began in 2010. At that time, I was more focused on geometry and high school jazz band. But jokes aside, it's telling that almost 15 years later, we're still dealing with this issue. The policy paper describes everything that has happened so far in the case, and it will describe what happens as the case continues. It's a living document. We intend to update it regularly as we continue to monitor PPD It can and it should be the place we start when we think about how Philadelphia begins to move forward, and we must move forward. Despite the good news that so much progress has been made on Fourth Amendment related issues, now that there are fewer stops and frisks categorically, and a smaller percentage of those stops and frisks are unlawful, the 14th Amendment related issues, the issues surrounding race, have unfortunately remained, as Mary Catherine said, consistent. That means that even though most stops and frisks are lawful, have a lawful basis, officers are still relying on race to make those stops and frisks. The 14th Amendment, as I'm sure everyone here knows, was enacted after the forcible prohibition of legalized chattel slavery, and it guarantees equal treatment by law enforcement. But Philadelphia's law enforcement haven't lived up to that mandate. Philadelphia's law enforcement is breaking federal law in that way. PPD and their use of stop and frisk, statistically speaking, is as racist today as it was when we filed the lawsuit back in 2010. Stop and frisk fails to meaningfully get weapons off the street, and it succeeds at continuing the racist legacy of slavery. While MC said around 5% of the stops are actually yielding weapons, that is a very recent change from below 1% up until I want to say about 2020. All of that is detailed in the policy paper. And still at 5%, when the stated reason for stop and frisk as a police tactic is to get weapons off the street, a 5% success rate is a very poor success rate, if you could call it that. Stop and frisk has been and continues to be used as a way to control where Black and brown people are in the city. And many have said that they feel as though they're being forced to show their papers, just as if they were doing so for the slave patrol. Eddie Azari Jr., 27-year-old Puerto Rican man, officers approached him while he was in his own parked car. Stopped. Police officer shot and killed him. Alexander Spence Spencer, 28 years old, Black man. Officers approached him in a North Philly corner store. After he was stopped on the ground, restrained, and tasered, officers shot and killed. PPD is acting like it's 1824, not 2024. Philly officers are acting like it's okay to be racist and control Black and brown people with violence. That's not morally correct, it's not ethically correct, and it's not legal. The job is not done. Calling out stop and frisk as the failed and racist policy that it is, as important. It's as important as it is as it was in 2010 as it is today. That's because the current mayoral administration's rhetoric threatens to undo all the progress we've made since we filed the Bailey lawsuit. With community advocates engaged on the issue, pushing for something better, as well as the ongoing monitoring under the Bailey consent decree, we can hope to prevent the city from regressing back to failed police tactics and begin to invest in the programs and services that have been scientifically proven to make Philadelphians safer.
Thank you, Saul. Thank you, Mary Catherine. We're going to open up for some questions now. If you have a question, you can use the little raise hand button there at the bottom of your screen, and we will take a few questions if there are any. All right, let's go to Sammy.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I work at Kensington Voice, so neighborhood newspaper in Kensington. We are seeing a really high police presence in the neighborhood, especially after these 75 academy graduates were dispatched. What is being done to kind of track what these officers are doing? And will we be able to tell whether their conduct in Kensington is a violation?
Yeah, I'm happy to address that. Thanks to the consent decree, the police department generates very detailed reports of the police use of stop and frisk that we can look at, not just on a district level, which is important when you try to figure out what kind of change is happening in the 24th district, But even on a police service level, which is a subset of a district, the Bailey lawyers team is very aware of the changes happening in Kensington and will be reviewing those reports, those statistics. The police department gets them on a practically real-time basis, and they will be addressed if necessary, in front of the judge. Everybody involved, including the judge in the Bailey administration, in the Bailey consent decree, is very aware that there are changes happening there, and that we want to watch and make sure that nothing there is bringing is either backtracking on the legality of stops or otherwise endangering the progress that's been made or threatening the promises that were made under the consent decree.
Could I ask a quick follow-up?
Mhm.
So what does it take to get that concern before a judge? I mean, can you talk to the judge at any point about it, or sort of what venue or when would that happen?
Yeah, so the consent, this whole situation with the consent decree is a very open communication. Honestly, if the court saw things in the papers and had questions, the court could call us in for a conference. The first thing we would do in seeing anything unusual is talk to the city and say, this is what we're seeing. We need an explanation. We need, if it's something we think violates the terms of the consent decree, we need a plan to fix this. So always we start by talking to the city, because that's the quickest thing to address issues under the consent decree. But if we could not get satisfaction, it would take a letter to the court asking for a conference. It is not a difficult process.
Sammy, I also wanted to add, just to more towards your first question, the ACLU of Pennsylvania has also been in close contact with several care workers and advocates on the ground in Kensington, and have been advising them of how to best document things as they're happening, specifically with regards to policing. We've also been in contact with some of the larger legal observer outfits, and helping them recruit folks to be able to train more people, so that there could hopefully be more observers on the ground. And are in addition to the monitoring that Mary Catherine talked about with the Bailey legal team, the ACLU Pennsylvania as a whole is also monitoring what's happening, and it is very engaged, specifically with regards to policing and other activity in Kensington.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Okay, it looks like we also have a question from Mensa. Mensa, let me bring in. Go ahead, Mensa. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, I'm sorry. Good morning, everybody. You both stated that the police are still violating the 14th Amendment, and they're using race to make traffic stops. Could you detail the evidence that you have to prove that? What evidence are you working with, to make that statement? And also the follow-up question: why is your paper being released now? What's the reason for the timing for the paper?
I'd like to start by saying that we are specifically talking about pedestrian stops with regards to this policy paper. Traffic stops were initially part of the Bailey lawsuit, and that lawsuit, though, MC, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the Defenders Association is handling the traffic stop aspect of it.
So not specifically under the consent decree, but the Defender Association is tracking, right, traffic stops. So why we say that stops are racially targeted is detailed in each one of the 14th Amendment reports that we file with the court. The most recent one was filed this spring. You can read the details of it. You can read the entire report on the ACLU website. And it starts with a pretty fundamental question, which is, if you look at a specific area, not a whole police district, but break it down by police service area, let's just compare, just as a start, the number of, say, Black people that live there, the percentage of people who live there who are Black versus the percentage of people who are stopped there who are Black. And you see, there's every one of these 14th Amendment reports has a table 4A that breaks down for each police service area. What is the percentage of Black population? What is the Black percentage of stops? And what you see is that as the population gets less Black, the disparity between the population level and who gets stopped gets greater, right? So in places that are majority population Black, it's not a surprise that most of the pedestrians who are stopped by police are also Black. But when you get to an area like Center City, where the Black share of the population is perhaps in the single digits or very close to that, and you're still seeing 40, 50, 60% of the people being stopped are Black. Why is that? Why is it that the people walking around who are stopped are Black? The rest of the report goes on to a very sophisticated statistical analysis that says, okay, that looks bad, but let's try to first rule out all the other factors that might innocently explain that. And so it does what is called a regression analysis to take out the effect of age, to take out the effect of crime rates, to take out other kinds of effects, until what you're left with is you cannot explain this racial disparity by any legitimate reason. It kind of comes down to people are more likely to be stopped because they're Black. And that is an analysis that we have done over and over and over again for the last 15 years. The city in 2020 conceded that they could not disagree with that racial analysis. That is why we now have, by agreement with the city, these court orders putting different processes in place to start to require reduction in racial disparities.
That was great. Thanks, MC.
Not sure if we got to the question of why now. Does somebody want to address that?
Oh, yeah, I think why now is because history is repeating itself. We once again have stop and frisk as a political issue. And again, it's flipped, right? We're back to 27, we're 2007, where there's a spike in gun violence and people are looking for a quote unquote solution. The point of this policy paper is to say more stop and frisk is not the solution to gun violence.
Great, thanks. So we have time for one more question. If anybody has a question, you can raise your hand on the Zoom interface here and we can call on you. While we're waiting, I will say we will be sending out a video recording of this press briefing with a press release in the next hour and a half, just as soon as we can process the video, and it'll be available on YouTube as well. Looks like we don't have any more questions, so thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Mary Catherine and Saul, and hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thanks.